We can go to
I took my
family reunion. That's what we on our way
first military training at the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville. And when I completed my study of law, I went to San Antonio to practice.
All right.
While I was at San Antonio, I participated with the 36th Infantry Division as a regimental S2s. That was intelligence and counterintelligence training. As the war clouds began to hover over our nation in Europe and in Asia, I became more concerned about what was going to happen. And the Army contacted me and sent me to Fort Benning, Georgia, where I went to the infantry school. I also went to the Command and Staff School at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, as the Army felt that I should get that training too. About that time, I realized that the war was going to break out sooner or later. And I talked to the Army headquarters there at Fort Sam Houston and asked them if I could go with troops. They gave me the command of a heavy weapons company in the 2nd Infantry Division, and I then began a series of training exercises which were conducted by the Army at Fort Sam Houston and the Army from the southern part of the United States. The Army at Fort Sam Houston was commanded by General Walter Kruger, and it was under orders to go to the Pacific Theater. The Army that we campaigned against in our practice sessions over from the south part of the United States was commanded by General Ben Yehu Lear. After these training maneuvers were completed over in East Texas, Louisiana, and South Arkansas, I was ordered to the 7th Army by General Kruger to go into his G2 intelligence, counterintelligence section of the Army. I was told that I would be going to the Pacific too, and I was put into the 2nd echelon for the travel. But before the 2nd echelon could travel to the Pacific, I received orders from Washington ordering me to go to the Naval War College in, I can't think of the name of the city now.
Was that Annapolis?
I can't think of it. My wife was here, she could tell you. But we'll remind her when she comes up. Anyway, I graduated from the Command and Staff. I graduated from the command course at the Naval War College, and they asked the Army to allow me to accompany the Navy to Hawaii. The Army refused to have me do that, and I was ordered for the 2nd time to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, to take a new course of study for the creation of airborne divisions, which was new arm in the United States Army.
About what year do you recall that?
What year was that? Was probably around 1942 or
early 40s,
beginning 43 maybe. Mm-hmm. After the completion of that course at Fort Leavenworth, I was ordered to Fort Bragg, where I was made the G2. for the 13th Airborne Division. The 13th became a training division for the Airborne Command, which was headquarters was located at Fort Benning. And I thought I would never get overseas because we just kept training units and they would go overseas.
This is the beginning of the Army Air Corps.
Yes. However, I received orders in due time to go to North Africa, where I went into the Army headquarters. I can't remember this general's name right now. I'm 93 years old. I just don't remember.
You're remembering an awful lot.
Well, anyway, when I got to the Army headquarters in North Africa, they were preparing for the invasion of southern France. And I then found that to create the crux of my intelligence headquarters for the Airborne Task Force, I had to go into Italy. And I went to Naples, Italy, and then further up to Rome, Italy. And there is where our units, airborne units, began to gather for the invasion of southern France. We were given the task of protecting the Army of North Africa that was going into southern France, to protect their right flank along the Franco-Italian border in the Maritime Alps.
What a job.
Yes.
What a task.
All right. What was interesting about the 1st Airborne Task Force was that it was composed of a Canadian-American unit. It also had a Japanese-American anti-tank unit. It also had a Special Forces unit that was commanded by General Walker, and it had the 517th Infantry Combat Team, which was the most renowned combat team in the Army. The Germans knew we were going to make an airborne landing in southern France, and they took the French farmers and made them put down anti-landing obstacles against our gliders and against our parachutists landing. On the night of 15th of August, really the 14th of August, our first echelons of the Airborne Task Force flew into southern France and landed on positions that we had selected, where at daylight they would be able to see what was happening at road crossings.
A reconnaissance type?
Yes, that's right. They had Rebecca radios. And at daylight, though, of the 15th, all of our airborne units, the gliders and the parachutists, all hit the ground. The amphibious troops on ships, they were coming in slowly, landing on the coastline. However, the airborne went in quite deep into southern France to seize certain cities like Limoux and others. And when the amphibious forces managed to fight their way up to where we were, and we were advancing slowly ourselves against the enemy, we were ordered by the commanding general of the Army to wheel to our right and get on the Franco-Italian border and to protect that borderline, which was the flank of our army. Over in Italy, that's where Mussolini had just been caught and killed, and the Germans were retreating rapidly to go up to get ready for their offensive that brought on the Battle of the Bulge. We began to get orders for our troops to send some of our troops out of the Airborne Task Force northward for the Battle of the Bulge, the 517th and the British Brigade. We also had a British Brigade, I forgot to mention that, in the task force. I then returned to the 13th Airborne Division, which was sailing out of New York for Europe. I became the G2 again for the 13th. Nothing radically happened for the rest of the war. We were given several missions to land to try to capture German specialists who were far advanced in the things that later developed to be atomic and other things. We wanted to capture those people. Russia wanted to capture them too. It was a race between the United States and Russia to get those scientists. And as this was going on, we received orders. The V-Day arrived. We received orders immediately to proceed to the Pacific, the 13th Airborne Division. I was made a member of the advance party to go ahead of the bulk of the division coming over later. When I got to the United States en route to the Pacific, the first atomic bombs were dropped on the Japanese. Well, a halt was called, and I went back to Fort Bragg, and as we were disassembled, the 13th went out of existence. I was assigned to the 82nd Airborne Division as the acting G2, not the G2, but the acting G2. And following that, I received orders to go to the Antilles Department, where at Fort Brooke, Puerto Rico, we were given the task of disassembling all of the military stations in the Caribbean and in the Gulf of Mexico and down including Panama.
Had a lot of equipment to get rid of.
Well, yes, it was. People don't realize how important the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean was, because the Germans didn't do anything but sit out there and sink our tankers that went out with oil, and it was a mess. But we had our Air Forces, Army Air Corps was there, and they operated against the German subs the best they could. Well, after the completion of that duty at the Antilles Department there at Fort Brooke, Puerto Rico, I was ordered to Fort Benning and given command of an infantry battalion. And after 3 years of training with that battalion, I was ordered then to the infantry school to be an instructor at Fort Benning. But I didn't even get to sit down at my seat before I was ordered to Fort Sheridan, Illinois, and I was promoted to colonel, and I was made the G2 for the 9th Army Corps in Korea. When I arrived at Busan, Korea, the United States Army was hemmed in all by itself, trying to hold a foothold whereby we could get reinforcements, and then later to bring in UN forces when the UN decided to go in and help us do that. Well, the upshot of it was that General MacArthur was running things over there, not Washington. And it was decided that I wouldn't be G2, but because of my legal background, I would be the civil affairs officer for the Ninth Corps. I would be working with the President of Korea. I would be working with our ambassador from the United States in Korea. I would be working with the Army headquarters in Korea, and my section of operations would include the overall orders, but my duties would be chiefly in the Ninth Corps area, which included the 2nd Infantry Division and some other divisions. But the 2nd Infantry Division was the most important division to me because I had been there with it, you know, when I first went in Fort Sam. MacArthur made his move. He outflanked the army, the Korean army, North Korean army. And when I say the North Korean army, it was the Russian, the Soviets, the Communist army. It was the Chinese Communist army.
Fighting together.
Giving them some support. Russia furnished the air support. It didn't last very long against our air, and we got our air in pretty quick and wiped them out. But Russia didn't want a communist country on their border, and that is why they were backing up North Korea against South Korea. We didn't want South Korea, a democratic country, to be destroyed just because Russia wanted it destroyed. Well, this flanking movement by MacArthur forced the communists to race back to the communist border with Russia. Well, our forces moved up, but the big argument between Washington and MacArthur was, would we be able to fight against Russia, who was putting in forces which amounted to 7-1 in force strength against what we had. In other words, we were tremendously outnumbered, and MacArthur wanted, of course, to use the atomic bomb, and that would have handled the situation. He thought. Well, they decided. The United States decided they didn't want to use the atomic bomb, and that they would put in more reinforcements and try to win just by fighting an old-fashioned fight. Well, there was a lot of talk around Christmas in Korea that we'll be home in Christmas. Well, that wasn't true. The Russians launched their tremendous attack against us, and they overwhelmed us, and there was a terrific retreat. The 2nd Infantry Division was wiped out, and it was a crack division. And the Turkish unit was wiped out. We found Turks scattered all over Korea. Months later, it was like putting ice cubes in a hot skillet of grease, sizzling. It was just terrible. Well, we had other losses, tremendous losses, and we were again forced back into South Korea. We lost Seoul, the capital of South Korea again, and General Walker was killed in an accident, the American Army commander. But in came the new Army commander, General Ridgway, the airborne general. Well, I had served under him in France, and I knew him. Well, his first thing to do was to tour our front, which we were holding almost back to Tucson again. And he told the Army, the American Army and the UN Army, we are here to kill Chinese. We are not here to go anywhere. We're going to kill Chinese. Well, the fight took on a different tune. For the first time, we began firing our artillery, lapping the slaughter that we inflicted on the Chinese, caught up with what they had inflicted upon us. And then we began to get the edge, and we started advancing. Well, Russia felt their losses tremendously, just as we felt ours. And the United States and the UN and Russia, they had a conference in Paris, and they decided that we would get the same line between South Korea and North Korea again, and all of that would have been for naught, except we preserved the democratic South Korea, and Russia didn't have to take a democratic North Korea on their border. Well, after that was over, I went back to the United States, and they had put me in the Pentagon. And I became the director of training for the United States Army Special Forces at Fort Bragg. Although I worked in the Pentagon, I helped design the program for the first Special Forces, and I did that for 3 years. At the end of 3 years, they moved me up to the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the Pentagon. And when I got there, they gave me the assignment, which didn't disclose what I was doing, but it said that I was in charge of propaganda and clandestine warfare. Well, clandestine warfare fitted in a little bit, but propaganda was not very much. In fact, I only remember one thing that made me think that we were doing some propaganda, and that was that our American troops off the coast of China had, at the islands off the coast, we had hired fishermen to catch fish, and before they could die, they would stuff leaflets in them, and then they would put them back in the water, hoping that the Chinese would catch them, and that they would open it and read what was on the message on the thing. Well, that was about the silliest damn thing I ever heard. But anyway, that's where some of the money went. While I was there at the Joint Chiefs, the American Army Advisory staff went to South Vietnam, and there they set up an office to see what they could determine, reference what was going to be the war between North Vietnam and South Vietnam. There was nothing favorable about the whole thing. The South Vietnam didn't have an army, and the North Vietnam did have an army, because they had whipped the French at Dien Bien Phu and had taken that fort and kicked them out of French Indochina, as it was known then, instead of Vietnam. And the question was, what should the United States do? Well, I wasn't in Vietnam when they were talking about it, but they sent me over to see how the Special Forces were being set up, how they were planning to use the Special Forces. And I also had to go to Thailand to see what we were doing in Thailand, reference what we could do as the Vietnamese were using the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which was affecting Laos and the other countries.
That was a main roadway through
Yes,
those
that's
areas.
right. And of course, the special forces had made plans to take South Vietnamese, train them, and drop them in the vicinity of that road to do certain things. That was the planning. And I found out that we were planning also to do certain things in Thailand, and they didn't have an army either to speak of. When I finished in Thailand, I went to British Malaya and in Singapore, where the British headquarters was at that time. I got an overall reading, but I went up to Kuala Lumpur, where the British were with their special forces called the Gurkha Indian troops, the meanest troops you can imagine.
They're famous for their knives.
Oh, they're famous, you bet, the Gurkhas. Well, there I got the details of what their plans were, which were based upon what we were going to do in South Vietnam. I went back to the United States and I wrote my report, and the consensus of the opinion that I got was that we didn't want to fight in the Vietnam War, that we were not going to have the UN like we had in Korea, which was not enough. The North Vietnamese again had the support of Russia, again had the support of China, and it was simply a worse situation than Korea. Well, I wrote my paper, and it had happened that my superior in the special in the Joint Chiefs was an Air Force general. His boss was Admiral Radford, a Navy officer, and their knowledge of the Army Special Forces was nil. And when I laid my report down about the consensus of what I had heard and believed, that just put it aside, I'm sure. They never called me in, they never questioned me. Nothing was done. The wheels were turning. Well, my period of time with the Special Forces ended, and I was ordered to Paris, France, with a unit that was affiliated with the CIA. And I was given the name of Tagarelli. And if I look Italian, I'll eat your hat. But anyway, that's the way things are done. And after 3 years there, living in Paris, I worked in Germany. I was not allowed to go to Berlin, though. I went in the in keeping with the German nation. At the conclusion of my tour there, I was ordered back to Fort Sam Houston for my last tour of duty, and I was made G2 for the Army for my last 3 years. And
That'll help you to
thank you.
wet your whistle. Thank you. You might.
The Army at Fort Sam Houston had the Mexican border as far over as Fort Huachuca, and then that Army on the west. Just wanted to tell you what an Army headquarters does for the benefit of this nation. My assignment with the Army at Fort Sam Houston was that of G2.
Please explain G2 for the people that don't know.
Yeah, G2, intelligence and counterintelligence. And I was responsible to work with the Immigration Service, the Army, Navy, the Navy, the Army on our flanks, that is south and west, and every federal agency, every state agency in Texas and New Mexico. To do this, we had to know what aliens were moving in as appropriately, and some of them, of course, as wetbacks and that
illegally,
sort of thing, and where they were living, because they could not live close to important installations like where we stored ammunition, like where we did certain things for certain industries in the United States that are vital to our defense. And all of that required coordination of all agencies. And it is done. And for instance, when President Kennedy was assassinated, we all knew that this guy Oswald had been down to New Mexico City. We knew what he had done down there and did it. We knew everything. But we just didn't understand why he could be in Dallas and wasn't picked up and arrested when President Kennedy came there, because he wasn't. They could have picked him up for driving crooked or anything else. But those things happen.
You mentioned that you were in with the beginning of the Special Forces, when the Special Forces was just beginning. You mentioned that you were you helped to begin the Special Forces.
Yes.
You mentioned, I just have two questions. You mentioned that the Special Forces began to do certain operations. Would those certain operations have to do with kidnappings and assassinations? Or can you not talk about that?
No, but my work had something to do with assassinations in Korea. Mm-hmm. In Korea, the North Koreans would kill teachers, religious people. Mm-hmm. They'd kill anybody that didn't fit in with communism. They would do that. Also in Korea, it is thought, I have no proof, it is thought that maybe some South Korean officials wanted certain South Koreans who were friendly with North Korea to be taken care of. But the important thing was that with the United States forces and UN forces having to retreat like they did from the very beginning, when we only had a corporal's guard there. Our regiments had our divisions only had 2 regiments instead of 3, and our regiments were 1 battalion short, 2. Well, when we were so short of manpower at the very beginning, and we were being overrun by the Korean Army and the fleeing refugees, we couldn't tell one from the other. But we gave orders the best we could to the refugees what to do to stay away from where the fighting was. And there's no doubt but what that some South Koreans probably were killed by American troops firing or UN troops firing. They couldn't help it.
It couldn't be avoided.
Now, down toward the end, my work as far as, in other words, my job as civil affairs was to see that the Korean populace did what they were told by having our troops enforce what Sigmund Rhee, the president, agreed they should do. And to do that, one of my men was a very high official in the Korean National Police. The Korean National Police Force is the finest I ever saw in my life. It was so different. Sigmund Rhee could call any town and get a Korean policeman on the phone, and the Korean police moved with our army all along.
I think you worked together, sounds
Yes,
like.
and not only that, but I got more information about the Chinese building up because the Korean police got it from the refugees who were fleeing
Yes.
and getting out of the way.
So you got an intelligence source right there.
Yes, that's right.
That's great.
And but I wasn't. That wasn't my job to utilize that information other to pass it on.
Understand.
Because I wasn't G2, which the people in Washington thought I was.
Well, I'm coming to the end of the interview here because I've got to go do some other things.
Yeah.
I want to thank you
Yeah, well, you're welcome.
so much for your time.
Well, you're welcome.
And I'm William Anderson from Trinity.
Yes, okay. Are you with the
Just
paper and Trinity?
just a volunteer here.
Huh?
Just a volunteer for Charlotte and the
Yeah.
museum folks here.
Just for your own information.
Well, this interview will be part of a library at this museum.
Right
It will
here.
be- yes, sir.
Yeah, well, that's fine.
And I need to ask you, we're going to put on this video, we're going to put your name and your rank and all that. How would you like that to be appear on the TV screen? How would you like it to read?
William Jackson Blythe.
William Jackson Blythe?
Yeah, Colonel, U.S. Army retired.
Okay. And
Yeah.
Colonel U.S. Army retired?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's what we'll put on the screen. And,
Yeah.
and how many years total do you remember?
Well, I don't know exactly.
It's a long time.
Yes, you see, when I was in high school in Arkansas, they had a program called Civilian Military Training at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. It was a 3-summer course, red, white, and blue. Well, a friend and I, we hitchhiked from my hometown in Arkansas to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, and took that course for 2 years.
Wow.
Right. Well, when I came back to school, the second year, that summer, the end of that second summer, the state organized a National Guard unit in the town of Monticello, Arkansas. And the football coach and my history teacher were the same individual. And he had been in World War I. And he was made the captain of this new National Guard unit. So what did he do? I was the only one who had any military training. He made me first sergeant. Yes. Well, he had been my history teacher and my football coach, so I did it. And he was responsible for me going to the University of Arkansas and taking I can't think of the name. What was that?
ROTC?
ROTC, yeah.
Reserve Officer Training Corps?
Yes.
Well, that's fantastic.
Well, the funny thing is, when I came to Texas to take my bar examination, I was a second lieutenant in the reserve. And the best dance that was given in Dallas was given by the National Guard Cavalry Unit, who had saddled something like that one there, and the McClellan saddle. And I got to be a friend with them, not a member of the National Guard unit, but I became a friend with them and made all the dances. In other words, that's the only way I could have made the dances. And I did. And then when I came to San Antonio to practice law, the 36th Infantry Division had a regiment that included Seguin and San Antonio, the 141st. 143 had this company up here. And they didn't have, in the National Guard in those days, they didn't have a place for an S2, that's intelligence, counterintelligence, in their regiments, in their table of organization. They didn't have that. But they were allowed to employ a reserve officer to do the job. And for 2 years, I served that particular 141st Regiment of the 36th Division. And that's why I was always interested in the 36th. When I went into Italy to get my intelligence stuff organized there in Italy, the 36th was very active, and I was moving up right behind them. And I knew a lot of them. I say a lot of them, I knew some. And but I always had a particular interest in the 36th.